Hi there, it's Dr. Claire Ashley here again, and welcome to the second episode of the season 2 of the Do Yourself No Harm podcast. So today I'm going to be talking about guilt, shame, and burnout. Now, when I was reviewing my social media posts and in the discussions that I've had with my followers in the comments and in my DMs, one of the topics that comes up repeatedly is that of guilt. And so I've decided to dedicate an entire episode towards talking about guilt and the impact that it has on our individual mental health and well-being. Now, I think that this is a problem that doesn't just affect medics, but all caring professions, and in any profession where you carry the burden of responsibility in whatever form that takes, and particularly so if you are the type of person that is more prone to being a perfectionist, having imposter syndrome, being a high achiever, that sort of personality as well. So in order to understand how guilt can work against us, you have to be able to recognise what guilt is and what its purpose is too under normal circumstances outside of burnout. So guilt is the feeling of having committed wrong or failed in an obligation, or a feeling of responsibility or remorse for an event that has gone wrong or a wrongdoing, whether that's real or imagined. So I'm going to give some examples of when healthcare professionals might have felt guilty during the COVID-19 pandemic. So for instance, you've got the GP that feels that they should be in the hospital in the front line seeing patients with COVID instead of being in the community where we were told to shut our doors and to keep people away from the surgery if possible. We still see patients face to face, and we did throughout COVID. That's a separate topic for another day. The COVID ITU trainee who feels that they should be working in London and not a DGH because obviously London was more disproportionately hit with COVID, particularly in the early stages. The community nurse who feels that they should be doing more by working in A&E. All of these professionals worked in very difficult, very challenging circumstances, doing crucial roles during the COVID-19 pandemic, and yet they might experience guilt for feeling that they should be doing more. And outside of healthcare, there are lots of other things that might cause guilt. So you might feel guilty for wanting some time for yourself if you're a carer and you're caring for someone else. Or if you're a parent, you might feel guilty for not enjoying every moment with your child. Now, guilt has some advantages for professionals, in particular for those of us in caring, health, professions, or positions of responsibilities in some ways. It can promote empathy, it promotes being meticulous, and it promotes hard work. However, this can, unfortunately, sometimes lead to maladaptive changes, such as exerting undue pressure on ourselves, being excessively critical, and worrying often. For those of us that are in caring, teaching, healthcare professions, we probably knew from an early age that we wanted to use our skills and our knowledge to be altruistic and to help others better themselves or improve their situations. But quite often the need to do good can in part derive from hidden guilt, and this in turn can have really substantial negative effects on how we experience ourselves and our work. Hidden guilt and the need to do good can facilitate the quality of work when it's controlled, but it may also contribute to our collective vulnerability to burnout and mental health problems when it is not. Studies of nurses have shown that empathy is associated with positive outcomes for both the nurse and the patient. However, empathy that is found to be associated with guilt in studies, which can become excessive and misdirected, is in turn a risk factor for burnout and compassion fatigue. So you can see the link between guilt and in particular inappropriate guilt. So that's guilt where you haven't done anything wrong, but you might be working in a system that puts a lot of pressure on you, can then directly lead to compassion fatigue and burnout. So healthcare professionals in particular tend to be altruistic, and doing good is one of the best protections against feeling guilty. However, unconscious guilt might manifest itself in ways that harm us. So for instance, worrying about missing a diagnosis or worrying about an adverse event happening. Now, worrying about these things kind of protects us against guilt in a way because it provides to us as individuals evidence of conscientiousness and diminishes guilt by providing some internal punishment for it. The other thing is that these worries can feel realistic, and therefore they mask the irrational guilt, punishment, worry mechanism that is the true cause of these concerns. Guilt can be diminished by doing good deeds, but it can also be appeased by punishments. And in medicine and a lot of other professions, we have ample opportunities to punish ourselves. So in medicine, for instance, we might feel guilty about having difficult experiences in our jobs, which are outside of our control and outside of what really we should be feeling guilty about, but it gives us plenty of opportunity to punish ourselves. So when we feel guilty, we typically engage in modified and people-pleasing behaviours in an attempt to falsely rectify the guilt. So we stay late at work, we say yes to covering shifts when we really need to rest, we adapt to last-minute shift changes, we say yes to extra promises when we really want to say no. And the pressure of the COVID pandemic, and we are still feeling the effects of it, has meant that we have had to be more flexible, more adaptable, more resilient than ever. This is true of a lot of sectors. However, the problem is that we cannot fix the problems caused by the pandemic, nor can we fix the years of under-resourcing of the NHS that preceded it, and so our guilt drives us to punish ourselves repeatedly without redemption. And without redemption, we fall back into punishing ourselves, and the guilt-punishment cycle continues and may ultimately deeply affect our mental well-being. So staying on late, blaming ourselves for things that go wrong, struggling to enjoy downtime, being unable to switch off, and imposter syndrome can all be caused by guilt. And when guilt becomes a problem, the constant worry that comes with it is not because we're at work providing poor care or negligent care or doing a bad job. It's because we persistently torture ourselves. Why does this matter? Because studies on burnout often focus on external factors that precipitate the development of burnout, such as long hours, workload, etc. However, internal and individual factors such as empathy and guilt can also affect the development of burnout. And so what we're seeing at the moment is not just in healthcare, but in a lot of professions, is that the pandemic has kind of created this perfect storm of guilt that we can't rectify. And it's inappropriate guilt because we haven't caused these issues either in our workplaces. Now, as professionals, we might pride ourselves on rational decision making in our work, and I know that certainly I do. However, when guilt starts to affect how we turn off and relax outside of work, when it starts to infringe on the rest of our lives, we might have to accept that we need to address the irrational in all of us. Looking after ourselves has never been more important, and particularly so when we think about guilt's ugly sister, which is shame. So I want to start talking about shame by talking about a quote from Brené Brown, who's done a lot of work on shame. And she says this: if you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 ingredients to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in the petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. And so our experience of shame and vulnerability, I think it does directly impact our working lives, and again, particularly in caring professions, because our work, being vocational, often forms a crucial part of our identity, and this strong attachment to our work means it can be very difficult to separate our shameful experiences and our experiences of guilt as well from the self. So in healthcare, for instance, as clinicians, we might encounter shame in our clinical experiences with our patients. And when you perceive that you're failing your patients clinically, you may therefore perceive a failure of personality and of self. As a profession, we tend to be very hard on ourselves, and when times are tough, we tend to work harder in order to make up for our perceived failings, in order to ease the burden of shame on ourselves. But this strategy, despite being well-intentioned, is likely to lead to unhelpful coping behaviours and thinking patterns that might then spiral into physical or mental illness. We might also encounter external sources of shame at work. So as a profession, we're terrible, absolutely terrible at openly judging and shaming other doctors that are perceived to be in difficulty or struggling either with their workload, other stresses, or their mental health. Medical teaching also traditionally relies on this in its teaching methodology. Who hasn't experienced being reamed out in front of your other students or on a ward round, and you just want the ground to open up and swallow you whole when you've been publicly shamed? Now, I do think that we're moving away from this, generally speaking, but it's still present, and the scars might still be present in a lot of us if we've experienced it being aimed at ourselves. And shame is a really intense and powerful emotion. It taps into our deep-rooted fears that we're not good enough, we're not good enough people, we're not good enough for our work. And shame prevents us from really reaching our full capabilities, from connecting with others, from leading the life that we want to lead, and from working in the way that we're truly capable of. And so to come back from that previous quote from Brené Brown about how empathy can heal, change starts, coming from talking about shame and then meeting that shame in ourselves and in others with kindness and empathy. Your experience of shame, be it in medicine or outside of it, doesn't have to define you or your experiences of work. And I really hope that going forward, that experiences of shame and then the subsequent guilt and self-punishment and tortures that come alongside it can be minimized for everyone. Now, I've previously guested on a podcast talking about shame in medicine. And during that podcast, one of the quotes that really struck me was this. Quote is, "Guilt is the mistake you make, shame is the mistake that you are." And that quote has really struck with me, but perhaps not for the reasons that you might think. So I think that the problem is that with guilt, we haven't actually done anything to justify the guilt, particularly in the workplace. And that's what I'm trying to talk about here is that a lot of the guilt that we experience when we kind of spiral into burnout isn't because we've done anything wrong. It's because the systems that we work under are so pressurized and they break our brains and make us think that we're the problem and we're not. When I was struggling with my anxiety and with my burnout and with my depression, I was absolutely consumed by guilt and shame. And my thinking had become so disordered that I thought that because I felt ashamed and bad, therefore I must have done things that were worthy of being shamed, and therefore I was a bad person. But I hadn't made any mistakes, and I wasn't being a mistake at that time. And so that quote kind of sits with me for the wrong reasons. My head during my burnout had become such an utterly exhausting place to be. Shame absolutely had its roots firmly stuck in me. Now, the intensity of the emotion of shame is one that can really deeply affect how you feel about your work, feel about your ability to be a good clinician, to be good at your job, our relationships with our colleagues, our relationships with our patients, our relationships with ourselves. So what can you do about this? Well, I think firstly, recognizing that guilt and shame might be feeding into feelings of mental distress, overwhelm and burnout, particularly when we work in systems that tend to inappropriately place blame on the individual for their perceived shortcomings, is a good place to start. And then if you think that you're experiencing this and if it's directly impacting your ability to do your work, your function, your home life, I would really recommend that you think about having some therapy. I've gone through a very intensive course of therapy and it's been absolutely transformative in changing how I feel about myself and my thinking styles as well. It's really helped me to address some of the guilt and the shame that I carry with me, not just for, the work, general day-to-day work, but also with my burnout, because with my burnout, I was so incredibly ashamed that it had happened to me. And it's really helped to uncouple those feelings from the burnout as well. And the other thing that's really helped me is reflective writing. So there's a lot of evidence for journaling and for reflective writing and using it to help us to move forward. I will post a link in the caption to this video to some journaling prompts that I put together about guilt, because I personally found it really helpful to use those questions to reflect on my own internalized guilt and to deal with some of those emotions and to move me forward in my burnout recovery. And I hope that the same might be true for yourself as well. So that's a post that I did on Instagram. I'll link it in the caption below. So those were just some of my thoughts about guilt and shame and how it feeds into burnout. I hope that it's been a helpful episode for you. You can find me on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Claire Ashley. I'm uploading these videos to YouTube as well if you prefer to find me on there. You can also find me on my free burnout group, which is the Burnout Doctor. Everyone is welcome to join this community. It's for anyone that thinks that they are at risk of burnout or might be experiencing it. It's incredibly welcome. I would love you to come and join me. I'll put the link in the captions too. And if you also want to know a little bit more about my subscription box, which is also called Do Yourself No Harm, I'll link it in the caption below as well. Take care.